The world remembers them as stoner icons. Two guys who spent the 70 seconds laughing, partying, and living with zero consequences. But that legend isn't just wrong, it's a lie. Because before the fame, Richard Cheech Marin wasn't chasing a comedy career. He was running from the FBI. He was a draft dodger fleeing the Vietnam War. And Tommy Chong? He wasn't looking for a partner. He was trying to save a failing topless bar in a dangerous part of Vancouver. Everyone thinks their partnership was built on friendship and weed. But in reality, it was built on fear, trauma, and the desperate need to survive. Was in toss. Behind the laughter was a partnership so toxic they spent years trying to destroy each other. This isn't the story of how they made us laugh. This is the story of what it cost them to do it. Welcome to the true story of Cheech and Chong. There are stories in Hollywood that shimmer with nostalgia, wrapped in laughter and legend. And then there are the stories that feel different once you peel back the myths. The story of Cheech and Chong belongs to the second category. The more you learn about what really happened before the fame, beneath the jokes, and behind the shadows of their partnership, the harder it becomes to hear their laughter the same way again. Because behind every punchline was pain. Behind every joke was fear. And behind the duo that seemed unstoppable were two men trying desperately not to break. To understand the chaos, you have to understand the run. In 1970, Richard Cheech Marin was not a comedian. He was a fugitive. Born in South Los Angeles, the son of a police officer, Cheech grew up in a world defined by discipline, order, rules. He was studying pottery at California State University, imagining a quiet life surrounded by clay, not chaos. But the world outside his door was burning. The Vietnam War draft hung over the head of every young American male like a guillotine. Cheech opposed the war deeply. And when the notice came, he found himself cornered. Staying meant risking death in a jungle he didn't understand, fighting a war he didn't believe in. Leaving meant abandoning his family, his country, and his identity. Fear made the choice for him. He fled to Canada. He didn't walk into Vancouver looking for a stage. He walked in searching for cover. According to those familiar with the situation, the constant pressure of being caught turned every step into a calculation. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing safety. While Cheech was running from a war, Tommy Chong was running from a broken dream. Chong, born in Edmonton to a Chinese father and a Scots-Irish mother, had tasted the edge of success. He had been a guitarist in a Motown-signed band. He had felt the heat of the spotlight. But the music faded. The band dissolved. And Chong found himself back in Vancouver, left with the only thing his family owned: the Shanghai junk. It was a dim nightclub that smelled of cheap beer, cigarette smoke, and neon electricity. And it was failing. Desperate to save it, Chong tried something no one expected. He mixed a topless strip bar with experimental theater, nudity, and improvisation. A strange dream stitched from desperation. It was into this world, half nightclub, half chaotic theater, that Cheech wandered in 1970. When they locked eyes, there was no prophecy, no spark of instant friendship, just confusion. Cheech was a draft dodger looking for under-the-table work to stay fed. Chong was a struggling club owner looking for anyone who could hold a microphone. They didn't meet with a handshake. They met with caution, as if each man was trying to figure out whether the other was a threat, a distraction, or something else entirely. No one watching them in that dim light could have guessed that this awkward, mismatched encounter would ignite one of the most unlikely partnerships in entertainment history. Backstage at the Shanghai junk, the environment was half electricity, half disaster. Actors, dancers, and drifters wandered through hallways. Chong pushed the troupe to experiment, to improvise, to let instinct take over. He was trying to rebuild a vision of himself, one that felt artistic, real, alive. Cheech wasn't trying to be an artist. He was just trying not to get deported. But when Chong shoved him onto the stage between strip routines, something unexpected happened. The fear that tightened Cheech's voice sharpened his timing. The tension in his shoulders turned into comedic rhythm. The weight of everything he was running from became fuel. Then came the moment that changed everything. And it arrived like all great legends by accident. A sketch about a man named Dave. No script, no plan, just instinct. Cheech repeated 3 words, his voice rising in frustration. Dave's not here. The audience erupted. It wasn't polite laughter. It was the sound of a crowd hearing something fresh, fearless, and strangely human. Chong floated through the chaos with calm, mystical irony. Cheech cut through it with sharp, manic energy. Together, they created a comedic frequency neither had ever experienced. Something too wild to control, too real to ignore, and too powerful to walk away from. The world saw chemistry. They felt pressure. Their reputation exploded faster than either man could process. By the mid-1970s, they were performing across North America. Clubs overflowed. Word of mouth turned them into underground legends. They weren't comedians in the traditional sense, they were cultural lightning. But here is where the myth separates from the reality. Fans pictured them high 24/7s, drifting through life like the characters they played on stage. They imagined a life of endless parties, smoke clouds, and ease. The reality was brutal. Behind the scenes, Cheech and Chong were running a marathon that nearly killed them. According to tour records, there were years where they performed more than 300 days a year. Let that number sink in. 300 days of airports. 300 days of cheap hotels. 300 days of being on. They weren't partying until dawn. They were surviving. In a twist of irony that most fans would never guess, they became obsessed with health just to keep their bodies from collapsing. While the audience was high, Cheech and Chong were often at the local YMCA gym. They spent their free time lifting weights and running on treadmills, trying to build the stamina to perform the same high-energy show night after night after night. Their creative tension, once a spark, became a slow, agonizing grind. Chong believed he was the architect of their comedy. Cheech believed he was being erased from it. Arguments became routine. Decisions became battles. Silence became louder than applause. Then came the movies. Up in Smoke wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural revolution. But the transition from stage to screen intensified the imbalance. Chong took creative control, directing, shaping, structuring. According to those familiar with the situation, he believed it was the only way to protect the heart of their work. Cheech felt something dangerous, invisibility. Yet, the industry validated them in ways that were almost surreal. Consider the story of Jack Nicholson. During an early screening of Up in Smoke, the legendary actor was in the audience. He had recently been in a car accident and was suffering from a dislocated shoulder. Doctors had given him strict orders: do not move, do not laugh. But as the film played, Nicholson couldn't help himself. The pain was excruciating, but the comedy was stronger. Witnesses heard him groaning in agony, clutching his shoulder, tears streaming down his face, yet unable to stop laughing. He became their most honest test audience. But even with Hollywood's elite laughing along, the foundation was cracking. Chong wanted to direct everything. Write everything. Shape everything. What used to feel like collaboration now felt like possession. The tension grew with every film, with every decision, with every credit. Behind the scenes, resentment hardened into a truth neither man could say aloud. We can't keep doing this. As their fame grew, the world around them became increasingly bizarre. Their story is filled with details that sound like fiction but are documented facts. Take, for example, the iconic license plate from Up in Smoke, Muff DVR. Fans assumed it was a prop made by the art department to push the envelope. It wasn't. That plate belonged to a real person. And not just any person. It belonged to a Los Angeles police officer. The irony was staggering. A symbol of counterculture rebellion was actually the property of law enforcement. Or consider the movie that almost happened. In the mid-1980s, a serious proposal landed on their desk. The director of Friday the 13th, Part VI, pitched a crossover film. The concept? Cheech and Chong working as camp counselors at Camp Crystal Lake, facing off against the slasher icon Jason Voorhees. It sounds like a fever dream or a bad joke. But the studio considered it. We were inches away from a cinematic universe where stoner comedy met slasher horror. And then there was the filmmaking process itself. Their movie Nice Dreams wasn't built on a polished Hollywood screenplay. It was built on a script that was barely 3.5 pages long. Everything else? Improvisation, storyboards, instinct. They were making movies with scripts shorter than a grocery list and somehow turning them into box office gold. Their creative process was chaos. Their success was accidental. Their influence was unstoppable. But chaos has a shelf life. The split wasn't loud. It was quiet, calm, and devastating. By 1985, the friction had become unbearable. Cheech realized he had become a secondary character in his own creative universe. He had an idea, a song called Born in East LA. He believed it could revive their brand. He wanted Chong to collaborate on it, to make it their next big thing. Chong refused. Maybe he didn't see the vision. Maybe he feared losing control. Whatever the reason, the refusal cut deeper than either man admitted at the time. For Cheech, it wasn't just a no. It was a realization. The partnership could no longer grow. It could only suffocate. Cheech walked away. He produced Born in East LA on his own. It became a massive hit, a critical success, but it was a victory that tasted like ash, because it proved he didn't need Chong. And that realization broke the last thread holding them together. The silence afterward lasted years. Cheech rebuilt himself alone, acting in Nash Bridges, voicing characters for Disney, reshaping his identity from the stoner guy to a respected actor. He wanted to prove he was more than a cloud of smoke. While Cheech climbed toward mainstream respectability, Chong drifted into a different kind of storm. He moved into activism, into counterculture advocacy. But the world had changed. The war on drugs had turned aggressive, and in 2003, the irony of his life reached a terrifying climax. Tommy Chong was arrested. His crime? Selling glass pipes online. He wasn't a drug lord. He wasn't violent. But the U.S. government needed a symbol. They needed a headline. And who better than the face of stoner comedy? Chong was sentenced to federal prison. The man who had spent his youth running a topless bar to survive, who had built an empire on making people laugh about rebellion, was now sitting in a concrete cell because of it. It was a moment that revealed the darker consequences of the culture they once championed. While Cheech was walking red carpets for Disney, Chong was sitting in a cell, contemplating the cost of his legacy. Both men succeeded in their own ways. But both men hurt. And both men carried the ghost of the partnership they had lost. Decades passed. Anger faded into exhaustion. Resentment faded into perspective. When Chong was released from prison, the world looked different. Cheech watched from afar. Old wounds began to soften. They started talking again. Cautiously, quietly, like two war veterans meeting after years of silence. And then one day, they stood side by side again. It wasn't a return to the old days. They weren't the young, hungry men running from the draft or saving a nightclub. They were older, slower. It was something gentler, smaller, real. Two men who had survived fame, conflict, distance, prison, and reinvention, choosing to reconnect. Their reunion wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the comedy. It was about closure. The laughter was still there. But now underneath it lived gratitude. So, look at them again. Richard Cheech Marin ran from a war he didn't believe in. Tommy Chong ran from a dream that fell apart. Both ended up in a chaotic nightclub, performing sketches between strip routines, shaping a partnership that changed comedy forever. Their fame was built on characters. Their legacy was built on courage. But their story was built on fear, tension, brilliance, and pain. The world remembers the jokes. But now you know the truth hiding inside them. They didn't create comedy to escape reality. They created comedy to survive it. And that is why, after all these years, their laughter still echoes, and why it means more now than it ever did. Because when you finally understand the cost of their journey, the comedy stops being just funny. It becomes human. Did you know about the Friday the 13th movie that almost happened? Or that Cheech was running from the FBI? Which fact shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about the dark side of Hollywood legends, hit that subscribe button. You won't believe who we are covering next.